Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another Q&A on Forgotten Weapons. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we are talking about battle rifles specifically. So I have a whole bunch of questions here, kindly provided by the fine folks over on the Forgotten Weapons Patreon. If you would like to support Forgotten Weapons, or if you'd like to get your own question in next month's Q&A, consider heading over to the Patreon and signing up. Links in the description text below. Now we're going to start with a question from John that is very appropriate to begin with, and that is, would you like to define battle rifle? Does it have to be semi-auto? Yes, although select fire is also perfectly applicable. A battle rifle is a military pattern service rifle that is self-loading and chambered for a full power cartridge. Now, essentially every element of that definition is kind of fuzzy because, well, the term battle rifle is also kind of fuzzy. It's not an official technical term, but it is a term that is in pretty wide use, and I think actually does a really good job of conveying information that it's intended to convey. So fundamentally, battle rifles are really that group of Allied and NATO combat service rifles that were used between World War II and the early half of the Cold War. So fundamentally, we are talking about, We'll get to the cartridges in a minute, but fundamentally we're talking about really a series of discrete families of rifles. The AR-10s, the FALs, the G3s, and then a couple of other sort of ancillary rifles like the French Moss series and some others that aren't like full-blown families of rifles. But they do have to be semi-auto. So I do see some questions from people about, like, what about the Lee Enfield? Is that not a battle rifle? Well, by at least my definition, no, it's not, because it's bolt action. So battle rifles do go back all the way to basically before World War I. The Mondragon is probably the first properly recognized mass production battle rifle, although there were some Danish rifles, Madsen Rasmussen's, that date back several decades before that, well, a decade or two before that, but they were never really used in large quantity. They were used in small quantities. So essentially what we are seeing here starts with the Mondragon, potentially the Fedorov, and then definitely the M1 Garand, the German G41 and G43, and the Soviet AVS-36, SVT-38, SVT-40 family. Now, one of the other elements that is fuzzy in this definition is full power cartridge, which ties right into a second question from Cole, which I didn't properly organize here. Cole says, what exactly is the line between a full power rifle cartridge and an intermediate cartridge? Are there examples of cartridges that toe the line? Yes, there absolutely are examples of cartridges that toe the line because there is no actual exact boundary line. The closest thing there really is probably a definition that's accepted by a number of scholars, including, in fact, Nick Jensen-Jones of our own Headstamp Publishing, who's essentially set an arbitrary muzzle energy definition of 2,600 joules or 1,900 foot-pounds based on a cartridge being fired out of a 16-inch barrel. Now, there's nothing magical about that number. There's nothing special about that number. That's just the number that kind of does the best job of differentiating cartridges that are generally understood to be full power versus cartridges that are generally understood to be intermediate. It is, in fact, right in between the Czech 7.62 by 45, which is sort of like 7.62 by 39 on a little minor dose of steroids, and 6.5 Arasaka. Interestingly, that definition puts both of the Carcano cartridges, 6.5 and 7.35 Carcano, as intermediate cartridges, which, I mean, are they really? At that point, it does get into definitely a fuzzy area. There are some who would suggest case length or overall length as being relevant here, but those are also really fuzzy definitions, and they kind of seem like they'd work at first, and then you end up with some weird boundary cases that kind of ruin them. To me, really the distinguishing factor here is whether the cartridge is used for both rifles and supporting machine guns, because fundamentally the purpose of a full power rifle, a full power cartridge, is to be most effective as a machine gun cartridge. .30-06, for example, is significantly overpowered for an infantry rifle, but it's great for a tripod-mounted machine gun. When we see the intermediate cartridges come in, cartridges like 5.56, like 5.45 by 39, like 7.62 by 39, those are there's some sort of squad automatic weapon that uses them at a low level with the infantry, but as soon as you get to any sort of supporting machine gun, you see those guns chambered for a full power cartridge. So the classic example here is that the Soviet infantry used AKs in 7.62 by 39 paired with PKs and then PKMs in 7.62 by 54. So they have the intermediate cartridge for the infantry rifles and the full power cartridge for the supporting machine guns. During the first couple decades of the Cold War, pretty much all of the NATO forces did the opposite. They had one cartridge for both the rifles and the machine guns. And it would be 7.62 NATO. You see it with the US, like almost all the World War II, well, all the World War II countries, except for ultimately Germany at the end of the war, stick with this full power cartridge. It's ideal for machine guns, it's overpowered for infantry rifles. If you swap it around and try to use an intermediate cartridge for everything, you end up with a cartridge that's really well optimized for the infantry rifles, but it's just not powerful enough for supporting machine guns. It's okay for a squad automatic that's just there to boost the firepower of a small squad a little bit, but the guys who are sitting at the back with the tripod-mounted belt-fed heavies, you don't want that in 5.56. You want that in a full power rifle cartridge. So to my mind, that's kind of as good of a differentiator as anything, is to look at the cartridge and then look at the military structure around it. And if there was a heavier round that was used for the machine guns, then there's a pretty decent chance that you're looking at an intermediate cartridge. If there wasn't, pretty good chance you're looking at a full power cartridge. Now, I actually have a book that I've written on NATO Cold War battle rifles that is just finishing up in the printing process right now. I've actually done all the signature sheets. The pages have all been printed. The covers have all been printed. They're just in the final stages of binding. It's looking like it will be here in time for Christmas deliveries for folks who pre-order. So if you're interested in that, check it out. I have a link to that in the description text below where you can pick up a pre-ordered copy. That book focuses on the battle rifle as specifically the NATO Cold War rifles, because that's really what people are thinking of when they use the term battle rifle. It's that sort of time period and firearms design and supporting military infrastructure. So the book's got all sorts of cool stuff in it. We got FALs, we got AR-10s, we got some Danish stuff, some Swedish stuff, developmental American stuff, all the way back to the Mondragon. It's very cool. All right, let's move away from the strict definition of a battle rifle and into some more substantive questions. We'll start with Chris, who says, with the adoption of the 277 Fury, 6.8 by 51, by the US, do you think there will be a global trend away from intermediate calibers? No, I really don't. I continue to be surprised that the US is moving forward with the XM7 or M7 and this new 6.8 by 51 millimeter cartridge. I think it's a bad idea. I think the compromises are poor. I think the intermediate cartridge was absolutely the better plan. The Germans figured it out and had a really good idea with it at the very end of World War II. The Soviets jumped on that good idea and exploited it at the beginning of the Cold War, and it took NATO 20, 30 years to catch up, essentially. Battle rifles are cool. They've got a lot of aesthetic neatness, and there's a lot of military history around them that's interesting. But in terms of actual infantry operations, I think the intermediate cartridge is a much better option. It allows infantry rifles to be more shootable, more controllable, and perhaps most important, it allows infantrymen to carry a substantially greater amount of ammunition. Some of the early testing of the M7 in combat trials, or pseudo-combat trials, has run into problems of guys running out of ammo really quickly because they're carrying like 50% less ammunition than they would be used to, than they would carry with a 5.56 based rifle. So the logistical advantage of having your support machine guns in the same caliber as your infantry rifles, to me, is not substantial enough to make up for the disadvantages of particularly infantry ammunition carrying capacity. We have a lot of smaller scale units that seems like have less sort of structural support behind them. You know, in the World War II era, infantrymen could get away with carrying 100 or 150 rounds of ammunition total. You know, in an M1, your web belt carries 80 rounds, and then maybe you throw an extra bandolier of another 40 on top of that. And okay, you got 120 rounds. That's even less than the M7 today, but there's a support structure built around getting guys more ammo, and it doesn't seem like that's quite the way of warfare as we see it today. So do I think other people are going to follow us on this trend? I hope not, for their sake. I don't think it's a good idea, and I expect that the US will walk this decision back or leave it in limited adoption. I hope they do. Boy, if not, I hope we don't get into any real wars, because I don't think it will go well. George says, with forced reset triggers and super safety selectors coming out more and more for more and more rifles, how many people will be discovering that getting rid of full auto on battle rifles was a good idea? Most of the people who attempt or who do install a pseudo full auto trigger in a 7.62 NATO battle rifle will in fact discover that it's not very practical. It can be a lot of fun on the range if you're mag dumping into close range targets or just backstops or piles of garbage. It's fun to ride the lightning with full auto battle rifles, but if you're actually trying to make hits on something that's more than about 5 yards away, it's not that practical. I know there are going to be people who will defensively react that they can shoot full auto just fine and, you know, you should get stronger or something. But the fact of the matter is, the better you are at controlling that battle rifle in full auto, the even more better you're going to be at shooting it in semi-auto and conserving your very limited 20-round magazine that is one of probably 3 or 4 or 5 magazines that you have on you if you're in an infantry role. So yeah, people will definitely discover that full auto is fun, but not practical. And the fact that a lot of military issue battle rifles were in fact only semi-automatic, and then there were another batch that were issued originally or manufactured as select fire, and then when issued out to troops, neutered down to semi-auto, is really not a bad thing. Even with modern select fire intermediate caliber assault rifles, semi-auto is virtually always more effective than full auto. All right, next up, Cricket says, if contemporary military cartridges like 7.62 NATO or 7.62 by 54 rimmed are out of the question, what would be your dream boutique AR-10 chambering, cost and engineering hassle notwithstanding, 303, 7.5 French, 7 Remington Magnum, etc.? For me, there would be 2 possibilities, and it depends which way you want to go with the rifle. So if I have to deal with the bulk of a full-size, full-power rifle cartridge, either I would want to go to very large, like maximum bore diameter, subsonic suppressed, essentially a Q boombox, which is an AR-10, not strictly an AR-10, but it is a modified AR-10 platform in 8.6 blackout, or again, if the engineering were such that the magazines would work, getting even bigger than 338 would be even better. You could go like 375 Raptor. It's probably about the biggest that you're going to end up getting in a 308 based case. Or I would go the other way and go with a lighter bullet, smaller bore, high velocity cartridge, basically 6.5 Creedmoor. 6.5 by 55 Swedish would be a great cartridge, but it's a little too long for the AR-10 platform. 6.5 Creedmoor is kind of the modern equivalent thereof, and it gives flat shooting, lighter recoil, controllability, long range capability. I think that's a pretty good optimal way to go with a full power rifle platform these days. Troy says, the era of battle rifles and bullpups developed seemingly along parallel lines, but we never saw anyone adopt a bullpup battle rifle. Why not? I've had limited experience with the Desert Tech and the Tavor 7, and the bullpup design seems to mitigate some of the downsides of a long, heavy battle rifle, or am I missing something? No, that's true. It does definitely mitigate some of the length issues. Weight, less so, potentially, but the idea of a bullpup to save weight doesn't usually, it sounds good on paper, it seems realistic, but it doesn't usually actually work out that way. The one that was technically adopted, although never put into production, was the EM2 in 7.62 NATO, which was a full-power bullpup battle rifle. It just got unadopted really quick by Winston Churchill and never actually produced, and the British adopted the FAL in its place instead. I think the reason for this is really primarily that bullpups were, like, the development interest in the bullpups came after everyone had already adopted a full-power rifle, and when they were starting to look with much more interest at intermediate cartridges for military use. There's nothing fundamentally incompatible about a full-size cartridge in a bullpup platform. Just the developments are offset by a couple of decades. The prevalent interest and theories at the time didn't match up. So the British did have a bolt-action bullpup, the Thornycroft, that was in, well, pretty much experimental use only, but they are out there. Beyond that, you don't have a whole lot of bullpups being adopted until like the 70s, and by that time it's all intermediate cartridges. All right, I got this question from a couple people as well. In particular, both Joe and Patrick asked, of the BM59 and the M14, which would you say was the superior final form of the M1 Garand? I have to go with the BM59 on this one. Even if you assume that both rifles were produced, like manufactured efficiently and effectively, which was the real downfall of the M14. It wasn't the design itself, it was the production and the QC and the development process that was its major problem. But the BM59 essentially got to the same place with less complexity. So they both got rid of the M1 Garand's dogleg operating rod that was a bit complicated to manufacture. That was a thing that the US was really kind of trying to get rid of throughout all of the production of the M1. They had a bunch of different experimental M1s that were focused specifically on simplifying the manufacture, in particular of that bent op rod. The M14 gets rid of it by changing up the gas system substantially. The BM59 essentially gets rid of it by just dropping the gas block a little bit so you can have a straight gas piston. The BM59 is a shorter, handier rifle. They're both going to have some accuracy issues. No one ever really tried to make the BM59s into precision rifles, and if they had, I'm pretty sure they would have run into the same sort of bedding issues that the M14 has. It's a battle rifle. It's really not that great as a precision rifle or a marksman's rifle, but BM59 is shorter, it's handier, it gets more useful goodies on it. You get the grenade launching capability if you want it. You get a way better bipod, or a way more practical bipod than on the M14s that got bipods. Instead of having this clunky big thing that has to clamp on, the BM59 bipod is relatively simple and light and unobtrusive. It's less adjustable, but for the purposes of a bipod on a rifle like that, which is largely to support it in full auto fire as a pseudo light machine gun, I think the BM59s does the job just fine. The folding stock on the BM59 is not great, but the folding stock on the M14 doesn't exist, so who's the winner there? And pistol grips on the BM59 were, again, a little bit of a kludge because of the M1 Garand moving trigger guard takedown mechanism, but they're better than the pistol gripped version of the M14, which was even more of a kludge. So yeah, between those two, I have to go with the BM59. Wayne Wiki says, does any military, large or small, still issue a battle rifle at this point? Yes, and also, yeah, actually. So the yes is, yeah, there are a bunch of militaries that actually still have a surprising number of rifles, usually G3s. These aren't the first world NATO countries that you might initially think of who were at the forefront of adopting these rifles in the first place. But there's a lot of smaller countries that don't have the money to be adopting every new pattern of rifle that comes down the chute, or replacing guns en masse. And a bunch of those people still have battle rifles, the G3 being the most common today. The other answer to this is yeah, because the US just adopted a new battle rifle, which we talked about up at the top. The M7 is absolutely fundamentally a battle rifle. It's more battle rifle than some of the previous battle rifles. It's a more powerful cartridge. It's a heavier rifle. it has all of the pros and cons of the battle rifle, but exaggerated in both the pro and con direction, I think. Dalbunaski says, SBR battle rifles, is there a point at all? If you shorten the barrel of your battle rifle, and shortening it is all the rage these days, you lose so much velocity you might as well be using an assault rifle. Yes and no. That is true, although maybe not quite to the extent that people would exaggerate it. So I did go and get a few numbers here for you. If we look at 7.62 NATO, out of a 20-inch barrel, which is pretty typical standard full-length barrel for most combat rifles these days, or Cold War era, you're getting about 2,800 feet per second. When you then can drop about 2.5 inches per 100 feet per second. So at 17 inches, you're at 2,700. At 15 inches, you're at 2,600 feet per second. In order to get down to 2,350, which is the muzzle velocity of 7.62 by 39, albeit with a slightly lighter bullet. So an AK is 2,350 feet per second with a 123 grain bullet. Standard ball 7.62 NATO is a 147 grain bullet, which will be traveling 2,350 feet per second out of an 11-inch barrel. And that's pretty darn short. Usually, if you see people SBRing battle rifles, they're going to be more in the 13-inch range, and that's still 2,500 feet per second. So by our full power cartridge definition, that's still going to be just up on the full power side of the scale. The thing with, so you don't see militaries running short-barreled battle rifles, with the exception, again, of the US M7, but its cartridge was specifically designed to allow a short barrel without reducing the muzzle velocity, which is why it's such a ridiculously high-pressure cartridge. Beyond that, militaries really don't do short-barreled battle rifles, or they certainly don't do them for standard infantry use. You'll see some special forces guys doing it, because even when you do cut those down, you are still better off than having an assault rifle. Now, on the civilian side, or shall we say on the Instagram side, where you see people doing it because they look cool, there is no ballistic requirement. There's no ballistic standard for that sort of stuff. If you're out having fun at the range or LARPing or shooting competition, it doesn't matter if your 7.62 NATO with a 5-inch barrel is actually less powerful than an AK, because it's still throwing a bullet really fast. Like, it is absolutely a gun, and it's capable of doing all the things that you actually need it to do if you're that civilian guy out for competitive or recreational shooting. John says, what is the ideal caliber? We Brits looked at the 270 pre and post World War II. There is no ideal caliber. It's all about what's the goal, and then you can figure out what meets that goal the best. 270 has ended up being, 270, 6.5, 6.8 millimeter has usually ended up being the best compromise between bullet weight, stability, velocity, ballistic coefficient, payload capacity. That's something that a lot of people on the civilian side don't think about that is relevant for military cartridges. On the civilian side, we just shoot ball ammunition, solid bullets. On the military side, there is usually a requirement for a variety of specialized ammunition. You want to have tracer ammunition, you want to have armor-piercing ammunition. I don't know if they still do it quite so much, but in the old days, you wanted to have explosive or observation ammunition, incendiary ammunition if you're shooting at aircraft. And all of those things require volume inside the bullet. When you get bullets that are too small, you run out of having it. You don't have enough volume to have an effective variety of specialty rounds. So 270 has often come out as sort of the best compromise, but it is a compromise, which means people have often chosen other things to maximize different characteristics. So, like, if you want reduced recoil, full auto controllability, and large magazine capacity, a short-cased 5.56 actually can do really well, which is why that's what pretty much the whole world's militaries have adopted these days. Land Cruiser says, can you please share information on common battle rifles, i.e. FAL, etc., that were produced or sold in full power cartridges besides 7.6 NATO? 7.62 NATO. There really were very few, and that's because the battle rifle as we think about it today was really a creation of the early Cold War years, where it specifically came about for 7.62 NATO. By the time these things were being adopted en masse by a lot of militaries, they were specifically looking for 7.62 NATO. So there were FALs, Venezuelan FALs in 7x49 millimeter, but a pretty small number of them, and they were all converted back to, or converted up to 7.62 NATO while they were in use. If you want non-7.62 NATO battle rifles, you really have to look to World War II and earlier, and that's when you see them in all of the other military standard calibers. So you'll see them in 30-06, 8mm Mauser, 7.62x54, the SVTs, the M1 Garands, the German G43s. I suppose the one NATO period non-7.62 battle rifle is the French Moss series in 7.5x54, which we'll talk about in a minute here, but is very similar to 7.62 NATO. Yeah, there was some production of the AR-10 occasionally in other cartridges, but very, very little. No one ever adopted these things in large numbers after World War II in anything other than 7.62 NATO. Yeah. Jordan says, would you consider the Colt Monitor to be a battle rifle? While the compensator would be unpleasant for one's team, it appears to me it was more suited to full auto than most other battle rifles. Yeah, definitely was. So the Colt Monitor is a lightened, somewhat shortened version of the BAR. It was adopted by the FBI as a quote-unquote fighting rifle. It's chambered for 30-06. That's definitely full power. It is selective fire. It is absolutely a battle rifle by all the standards that we've set up. It is still a bit heavier than a lot of the later battle rifles. It has more recoil, although it is tamed a bit by the massive compensator on it. I can think of worse rifles to use. A monitor with a suppressor could be a pretty darn cool thing. In fact, I'm reminded years and years ago, I saw this gun at auction. I actually have a video on it from way back when. I think it was Bob Ferris, who was a pillar of the machine gun community, who has unfortunately passed away a while back. It was his gun. He had taken a junky BAR and rebuilt it. He rebarreled it in 7mm Mauser because he could get tons of cheap ammunition, and then he rebuilt the pistol grip, the trigger assembly, to have a pistol grip. And if I remember correctly, it was like he cut the grip frame off a 1911 pistol and welded it on. Cut the barrel down. He essentially had basically kind of like a Colt Monitor with a better pistol grip in 7mm Mauser instead of 30-06, and it looked like a fantastically fun gun to shoot. He had put that together as, well, as a fun machine gun shoot sort of gun. You could fire it from the shoulder with, you know, reasonable controllability because it was in 7mm instead of 06, and that's kind of along the lines of a monitor, and it would probably be really fun. Andrew says, I know the answer is because intermediate cartridge in AK, but was there any more Soviet battle rifle development post-SVT-40? No, not really. Once they decided on 7.62x39 or on the intermediate cartridge, they stuck with it. There was development of precision rifles like the Dragunov, and there were a number of competing designs around the time of, you know, that the Dragunov beat for adoption. But in terms of infantry rifles, no, the Soviets left. The thing was, the Soviets left the 7.62x54 because it's not a great cartridge for box magazines. It's an obsolete round. If it had been a more modern round, maybe there would have been some more development in it, but as it was beyond some very experimental stuff, no, there wasn't. Michael has two questions here. First off, should NATO have adopted 7.5x54 French? Would it have made any difference? That's an interesting question. Ballistically, 7.5 French is just a hair below 7.62 NATO in terms of both bullet weight and velocity. 7.62 NATO is 147 grains at, what, 2750, 2800 feet per second, depending on barrel length. 7.5 French is 139 grains at 2700. So it's really close, a little bit less powerful. It actually has substantially lower chamber pressure. It's like a 40,000 psi round instead of 50,000, which is why there were problems converting French Moss rifles to 7.62 NATO. Would it have been better for NATO? Not really. I think it would have been pretty much indistinguishable in terms of rifles and capabilities. Like all of the NATO battle rifles could just as easily have been made in 7.5 French. If they'd been designed for that, it would have been super easy. You know, basically the same power, the same overall cartridge length. It would have actually been maybe a little bit lighter, maybe a little bit easier to work with because it is a lower pressure cartridge. But that doesn't convey any real benefit or any significant benefit. It does mean that the French would have remained compatible with NATO arms, which they didn't. The French never did go to a 7.62 NATO rifle because de Gaulle decided to pull French troops out of the NATO military standardization because he didn't like the idea of French troops under American commanders. But that's really the only benefit there would have been to NATO in using 7.5 French. Is like it would have been very convenient for the French. But that's about it. It's essentially it's one of those things. It's a substantially identical round that just isn't interchangeable. Michael's second question is, would a 308 AR-18 have been possible? Might it have been practical? Might it have been successful? It was absolutely possible because it does exist. That is the AR-16, and I believe there were 2 or 3 of them manufactured, and today all of the survivors reside at the Institute of Military Technology, that is Knights Armaments Firearms Museum down in Florida, and hopefully I will be doing a video on them soon. I have had the chance to fiddle with them and take them apart. It's a bulky AR-18 on steroids. They're super duper cool. Never took off, I think because basically by the time the AR-18 was being marketed, it was, again, kind of like bullpups. The intermediate cartridge was already the more desirable thing, and so while they developed and built a couple prototypes in 308, it was a question no one was asking until today, when people just want guns because they're cool, instead of because they have to make practical sense for a military adoption. Two different purposes behind having them. So could it have been practical? Absolutely. Could it have been successful? I think if someone had wanted it, there's no reason that it couldn't have been successful. We see guns today that are not that far off. If you look at some of the commercial 308s battle rifles, a lot of the commercial rifles are built on AR-18s, and a number of those are convertible to 7.62 NATO or were built in 7.62 NATO, and they work fine. There's no reason that the AR-16 couldn't have been feasible. It's just not the right thing at the right time in the right place. Brant says, how do you see the development and adoption arc of battle rifles differing from today if 280 British or a similar round had been adopted instead of 7.62 NATO? For this, I'm going to go back to my very early definition based on whether you use the same cartridge in your rifles and your support machine guns. If NATO had adopted, the British and the Americans had adopted a round where, like a 280 round, and had all their machine guns in the same 280, I don't think much really would have fundamentally changed. I think they would have eventually come around to a preference for an intermediate cartridge in the rifles, a heavy cartridge in the machine guns. If they had adopted an intermediate cartridge that was light enough to basically preempt development of something like 5.56, then I think we would have heavier caliber machine guns in use today. There would have been something like, somewhere between that Swedish 8x63 heavy machine gun round and the 338 Norma that U.S. Special Forces occasionally uses today, something in that range to give heavy machine guns more range and more punch. But the intermediate cartridges from the early Cold War were not nearly as intermediate as 7.62x39 and 5.56. They tended to be closer to the sort of 6.5 Carcano range. So I think, short of adopting going all in, and like the Soviets did, no matter what cartridge NATO adopts in the 50s, I still see it getting dropped in favor of something like 5.56 a few decades later. Leon has also a couple of questions here. First off is battle rifle a useless definition? Does it have any real value in the modern era? Well, I mean, XM7, apparently it does. To me, it is a definition that's useful for identifying this specific group of rifles. Tends to be the AR-10s, the FALs, the G3s, the French Moss. Those are the battle, that's what we think of with battle rifle, and that's what the term is intended to evoke. So I think it's a perfectly useful term. Whether or not it's the rifle that the military ought to be using is a totally different question, which we've already addressed. His second question is, from memory, the early SCAR program prototypes were able to change caliber. Should future projects consider this a good decision and explore this in their development? I think no. I have a video coming up on the Colt 901 that was part of the SCAR program. The benefits of being able to change calibers, I think are massively outweighed by all the logistical overhead and practicality of, you don't want one rifle that's a compromise at doing a bunch of different tasks. You want a couple of different rifles that are ideal for the task that you intend for them. The infantry should have a lightweight, controllable assault rifle with lots of ammunition. Designated marksmen should have typically a heavier rifle that is capable of a bit more precision and longer engagement distance, and maybe that means a heavier cartridge. If it does, great. Like, build that rifle to be the best designated marksman's rifle it can be. Make the infantryman's rifle the best infantry rifle it can be. Don't try to get false savings by picking one rifle that can become either of the two. What makes a lot more sense, I think, are what we see a number of militaries doing today. The Estonians have already done it. The Swedes and the Finns are both in the process of doing it, and that is adopting two distinct optimized rifles, but rifles that have a lot of similarities. So when you go to an AR platform, having an AR-15 and an AR-10 pattern rifle, AR-15 for the infantry, AR-10 for marksmen, that makes a lot of sense. You get cross-training. A few of the parts will actually interchange, which is convenient, but you've still optimized both of the rifles for their actual roles. It's just it becomes easier for guys to switch between the two guns because the handling and the controls and the maintenance and the function is all essentially exactly the same. That makes a lot more sense than trying to build a modular interchangeable rifle, to me. And Leon's third question is, are battle rifles like PDWs? Most people in units don't need them or don't have the training to make the most of them. Is their use case too specialized? To me, that question sort of implies, I think it sounds to me like it's based on the understanding that a battle rifle is a long-range precision marksman's rifle. In which case, yeah, it is absolutely a specialized weapon that requires some specific training and is best used in specific circumstances. Beyond that, is an assault rifle an overly specialized tool? Well, it does require more practice to use effectively than an intermediate caliber rifle that has less recoil and more follow-up shot opportunities. So I will say, Leon, qualified yes. Jeff asks, how would you make a competition based on battle rifles? How should they be handled in mainstream competition? I don't think you really have to do anything special for them, aside from making sure that your steel targets, if you're using steel targets, are nice and robust, because battle rifles will absolutely put more wear and tear on your steel targets than assault rifles or intermediate caliber rifles will. If you wanted to adjust the rules for battle rifles, obviously you'd do it based on muzzle energy. You know, there have been pistol competitions that did the same sort of thing with major and minor calibers. And in fact, was it USPSA, I think, or IPSC, had rifle calibers. 3-gun certainly had. I think they still have. Maybe they've gotten rid of it. I'm not sure. Major and minor caliber rifles, you know, one for intermediate, one for full power. And typically what you would do is require, say, 3 hits on a target with an intermediate caliber, but only require 2 hits with a major caliber in recognizance of the major caliber's greater energy potential. You know, if you need 3 hits to make sure that you go through armor or a barricade or something like that, well, 2 with a larger caliber is going to be just as effective, so only make the guy shoot it twice. that the benefit there is it does encourage people to bring out those rifles. There are today a lot fewer of those people out there in the first place because battle rifle ammunition is a lot more expensive than 5.56 these days, and just fewer people shoot it, especially fewer people who want to get out there competitively shooting. I think they're a lot of fun. The last two-gun match I did was with Setme B, actually. So, and that's quintessential battle rifle, and it was a lot of fun. To me, I like the guns enough that I'm just willing to eat the implicit penalty of having more recoil and less capacity, and it's still fun to do. Nick G says, arm yourself, sabotage your enemy. The choices are SVT-40, MOS 4956, G41 or 43, and Hakim. This is going to surprise nobody, but I'm going to go with MOS 4956 for myself. I think that's going to have the best sights and the most reliable action, the simplest action. It's the best of those four guns. These are all guns with 10-round magazines. In fact, they're all guns with detachable 10-round magazines. That's usually where the MOS 4956 comes up short, is it's usually paired up against rifles with 20-round magazines. Well, in this case, they're all 10, so it's all the same there. The MOS has the best sights. It's got good aperture sights on it as opposed to the tangent sights on all of the other options. Tangent sights can be good. I prefer apertures. The MOS 4956 is also the shortest, lightest, and handiest of all of those guns. So that's the one I'm taking for myself. Which to best sabotage the enemy with? That's tougher. The other three, to me, are really fairly similar to each other. If I could say specifically a G41, instead of sort of a generic 41 and 43 family of rifles, the G41 is definitely the worst. Man, you give someone a G41M, that's definitely the worst. It's the earliest, it's the clunkiest, it's got this weird bolt system to it, it's the longest of all of the German World War II battle rifles, and the most likely to malfunction the most often. A well set up G43 is pretty good. A well set up SVT-40 is also pretty good. Both of those rifles, it's kind of luck of the draw, especially today, whether you get one that's in good shape and set up and running right, has the gas setting on an SVT set properly for the ammo you're using. On a G43, if you're going to shoot one today, I would strongly recommend getting one of the gas system kits to reduce the gas port diameter, because those are over-gassed guns, in order to make them more reliable, which means today you run the risk of them breaking, which you really don't want, because you're not on the steps of the Eastern Front, you're at your local range, and if it short strokes, that's not as much of a problem as if you blow up the gun. And then the Hakim is kind of in the same place. If you've got good ammo and it's properly set up, it's a good gun. It's a little long, a little heavy, but I will go with G41M as the worst and MOS 4956 as the best. Incidentally, by the way, it should come as no surprise that the MOS 4956, the best one of the bunch, is also the latest of the bunch. It's the one that had the most development time put into it and was the farthest along in that process of, you know, working out the bad ideas and bringing in newer, better ideas. All right, ACC says, had the powers that be had enough foresight, when was the earliest point in history that a mass battle rifle armed force would have been viable? I would say that the Mondragon, the Mexican-designed, Swiss-manufactured model 1908 Mondragon, was viable as a combat rifle. It would have been expensive. It would have been on the finicky side, a little bit unreliable, a little bit prone to malfunction, but viable. Those guns did work. They were not a terrible system. They were overly complicated, but that's 1908, and I think you could have armed a force with Mondragons effectively and successfully. And I would probably rather take a Mondragon than some of the other early pattern rifles, like the early Mauser semi-autos. Definitely better than some of the earlier like the Madsen, Rasmussen, prototype-y stuff. Mondragon was, I think, kind of at that inflection point where it's still clunky, but it's good enough. When we get to, like, when was there a large force armed with battle rifles? It'd be 1917, World War I. The French RSC 1917 is a battle rifle. It uses a 5-round clip instead of a detachable magazine, but it's a semi-auto full-power rifle. Those were, again, clunky. Disassembly is a real nightmare on them, but they are reliable. They were used. 86,000 of those things were manufactured, and a lot of them used in World War I. They were, in fact, the most common semi-automatic shoulder rifle of World War I, and really the only mass-produced one of the war. All right, Matt has a neat question here. What successful battle rifle adapted down to an intermediate cartridge is best, and why did it succeed or not? For example, G3 down to HK33. What successful intermediate cartridge rifle adapted to a battle rifle cartridge is best? So what's the best battle rifle scaled down, and what's the best smaller rifle scaled up into a battle rifle? Well, the first one, the downscaling, to me is super easy. That would be the AR-15, because it started as the AR-10, and it was scaled down to what became 5.56 in the mid-late 1950s, and it's the most successful rifle on the planet today. So that's, I think a lot of people don't think about, like, we think of the AR-15 as such a basic platform that I think a lot of people sort of just, without thinking about it, expect that the AR-10 is a derivation of the AR-15 instead of the other way around. As for small caliber rifles scaling up to battle rifles, I think the most successful story there would have to be the G3, because it started out as for the most successful rifle scaled up from intermediate calibers to full power, I think that would have to be the G3, because it really starts as an 8x33 Kurtz Mauser prototype. The next set of developments of the roller lock system by all of the engineers who are involved in it is in France, and they're using 7.65 by 35 millimeter. It's a French intermediate cartridge that didn't ever get adopted, but it's there. They're working with 30 carbine, and it's only after they move on to Spain, where the gun starts to become known as the Setme, that they start scaling it up to larger cartridges. And some of the early ones are long but deliberately low recoil controllable cartridges, kind of like the British attempts to compromise on 7.62 NATO with slight, steadily more and more powerful cartridges based on their 280. Well, the Spanish had the same sort of thing. They start with a 108 grain aluminum cored bullet that's intended to be very controllable in full auto, and then eventually have to get it to the point where it's chambered in 7.62 NATO to win adoption by NATO countries like Germany and Spain. So yeah, the FAL also started as a small caliber rifle. It was intended to be an intermediate carbine. Like, originally, FN had 2 rifle platforms it was going to market side by side as companion pieces. The FAL was the intermediate cartridge, and the FN-49 was the full power cartridge. But over the course of development and NATO trials, the FAL ends up in 7.62 NATO and kind of obsoletes the FN-49 out, much like the AK obsoleted out the SKS in Russian service. Hypnotoad says, why does the FAL drip so hard? My serious answer to this question is because the FAL saw worldwide service in all sorts of different environments, and that means almost no matter what part of Cold War military history you're interested in, there's probably a FAL involved in it somewhere, and so it gets associated with cool stuff pretty much everywhere. Like, everyone has their different ideas of what's cool, but the FAL falls into so many of those different categories. The jungles, the deserts, you can be in Africa in Rhodesia, you can be in the Suez Crisis, you can be in Malaya in the jungle, you can be in the Falklands in like not quite tundra, but like taiga. It's everywhere in every environment with all sorts of different factions and countries. And so there's a very large number of people who like it for some particular niche application, niche piece of history. And that's why it drips so hard for so many people. If you're super into the Hakim, well, it kind of only shows up one place, and you're not going to have a lot of people who are excited about it. FAL's the opposite. Loki asks, will the trend of moving back towards full power rounds usher in a renaissance of the battle rifle? Has the Ukrainian conflict accelerated or held back the return of the battle rifle? From what I've seen, the Ukrainian experience has confirmed the superiority of intermediate caliber assault rifles. When we see rifles used, they are generally at quite close range, which is the lesson that has been learned and then forgotten like for 100 years of warfare at this point. We see rifles being used with lots of rapid fire, close range, in situations where having a heavier cartridge with more recoil just doesn't really do you any good. Long range capability isn't that important with an infantry rifle. It is with machine guns. Longer range machine guns, absolutely. But like that's how intermediate caliber rifles work, is they get paired up with full power rifle cartridge machine guns, which are better at machine gun things, and they let the rifles be best at rifle things. So I do not think that the war in Ukraine is going to lead to a resurgence of battle rifle adoption or development. All right, and our last question comes from Nick, who says, is the SKS a battle rifle? And I thought this was worth closing out on because it's a question that comes up of, well, the SKS isn't an assault rifle because it's only semi-auto, therefore it must be a battle rifle? The answer is no, because it's not a full power cartridge. I know this is, I mean, these are sort of fuzzy and arbitrary definitions at the same time, but the SKS is one of those rifles that falls into a neither category. It's not an assault rifle, it's not a battle rifle. These are not two terms that specifically, that every gun has to fall into one or the other. There is a batch of others. Semi-auto combat rifles, you could call them. Semi-auto infantry rifles. There really isn't a fancy, catchy term for that thing. And there aren't that many of them. You've got the SKS, you've got the Rashid, you've got the VZ-52 and VZ-52-57. Basically early Cold War Eastern Bloc rifles before they kind of all went AKs, when there was still this idea based on development of the SKS where the mag-fed, detachable mag-fed select fire rifle is filling the role of a submachine gun for officers and mechanized infantry and elite troops, that kind of thing. And the standard infantry get a semi-auto rifle. There's this brief period where that remains a concept for the Eastern Bloc. And that's when you get all of these rifles developed. Essentially, it's the Czech 52 and the SKS. The Rashid's a little bit different, but no, they are neither fish nor fowl, and someone ought to come up with a cool, catchy name for them, which we can then adopt and also debate potentially endlessly. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. I think this is a neat concept. Some people are bugged by the arbitrary nature of the term, but it's there to bring to mind a specific group of guns that look really cool, have really interesting history back to the Cold War, which is, of course, why I thought it would be fun to write an entire book on them. There isn't a lot out there that covers all of the battle rifles, specifically with beautiful, fantastic photography, and that is what my Cold War series, Battle Rifles of NATO, is going to do specifically. So the pages are printed, the covers are printed, they're just in the binding process right now, and while I don't have a delivery date yet, it's looking extremely favorable that pre-orders will be here in time to be delivered by Christmas. So if you want the best book out there specifically on battle rifles with the best photography, check it out. I have a link down in the description text below. Thanks for watching.